I opened my late husband's toolbox looking for a screwdriver, and instead I found a bank statement with $50 million on it. My husband told me for 19 years that we were barely scraping by. So I called the number on that statement, and when the bank manager picked up, he said 4 words that changed my life forever. He left you nothing. Hey everyone, welcome back to Silent Revenge, the channel where quiet people take their power back, one true story at a time. It's Dee, and I am so glad you're here with me today. If this is your first time, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you don't miss what happens next, because trust me, you're going to want to be here for the rest of this one. And while you're at it, drop a comment down below and let me know what city you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. People tell you grief changes a person. Nobody tells you that grief can also hand you the truth, whether you're ready for it or not. And sometimes that truth is wearing a very expensive disguise. My name is Dee Callahan. I'm 42 years old and I live in a plain, paid-off little rancher on the edge of Nashville, Tennessee. Not the glamorous part, not Music Row, just a regular street with regular neighbors and regular problems. I married my husband Frank Callahan when I was 23, and for 19 years I would have sworn on anything you put in front of me that I knew that man inside and out. Turns out I only knew the version of him he wanted me to see. Frank passed away 16 months ago. Heart attack. Fast, quiet, over before I even understood what was happening. And in a strange way, that was very Frank. He never did like making a scene. We were not rich people. That wasn't a secret from the world. It was the whole foundation of our marriage. Frank worked as a shift supervisor at a regional freight warehouse outside Nashville. When we got married, he told me he brought home about $1,800 a month, creeping up to around $3,400 by the time he passed. He never got the chance to retire. We coupon clipped. We drove cars until the wheels practically fell off. When our dryer died a few years back, we had an actual 3-day argument about whether to replace it or duct tape it back together one more time. We duct taped it. I worked part-time as a receptionist at a pediatric dental office, and between the two of us, we made it work. We weren't struggling exactly. We were just careful. Painfully, permanently careful. In that way, a lot of American families are careful, where you tell yourself it's contentment, but if you're being honest with yourself late at night, it's really just quiet restriction. We never had kids of our own. Every time it came up, Frank would gently steer the conversation toward how tight money already was. Looking back now, that one still stings more than almost anything else. Frank was not a cold man. He was funny in his own dorky dad way, laughing at his own jokes before he even finished them. He brought me coffee every Saturday morning without being asked. Cream, no sugar, same as always. He remembered our anniversary, even the years I forgot mine. But he was private. I told myself that Wall was just part of who he was, steady, grounded, a man of few words. I never imagined it was hiding something the size of a skyscraper. Frank had one sibling. His younger sister, Debbie Callahan Reyes, 49, married to Tony Reyes, a commercial real estate broker living the flashy Scottsdale, Arizona lifestyle, stucco mansion, infinity pool, the whole 9 yards. Frank and Debbie talked every Sunday like clockwork. Inside jokes I wasn't part of, calls that went quiet the second I walked into the room. I told myself I was being paranoid. Turns out my gut was working just fine. When Frank died, Debbie was at my front door before the paramedics had even finished their paperwork. She let herself into my kitchen, opened my fridge like she owned the place, and made herself a cup of tea while I was still in shock on my own living room couch. I told myself, she's grieving too, don't read into it. I was wrong to brush that feeling off, and it wouldn't be the last time my gut tried to warn me. The estate seemed simple at first. Frank had a basic will, the house went to me, no surprises. Life insurance paid out $48,000, which mostly covered the funeral and a chunk of what we owed on the HVAC. His 401k had about $19,000 in it. That, as far as I knew, was the entire financial legacy of Frank Robert Callahan. For months I moved through what I can only call the fog of widowhood, closing accounts, calling Social Security, slowly going through his things because everything still smelled like him and I wasn't ready. Took me over a year to even open the toolbox in the garage. It was a Tuesday in late September, 16 months after he passed, when I finally worked up the nerve to clean out the top shelf of his home office closet, the one shelf I'd been avoiding this whole time because that's where he kept the stuff that actually mattered to him. His dad's old pocket watch, a shoebox of photographs, the deed to our house, which I needed because I was finally refinancing. I reached way in the back, past what I thought was just an old shoebox of receipts, and my fingers touched something flat and slick, a plain white envelope, unsealed, tucked flush against the back wall like someone had hidden it on purpose. 'Cause someone had. Inside was a single folded bank statement from an outfit called Sterling Crown Private Bank, out of Dallas, Texas. The account holder was listed as F.R. Callahan. The statement was dated about 6 months before Frank died. The balance read $50,462,918.37. I sat straight down on that closet floor. I read the number again. And again. And a third time just to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. My husband, the man who fought me over a clothes dryer, had $50 million sitting in a private bank account in Texas. I don't remember walking to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water I never drank, sat at the table for almost an hour, and then did the thing I always do when life throws something impossible at me. I picked up the phone and dialed the number on the statement. It rang twice. A man answered, calm, polished, the voice of somebody who's never once raised it in his life. Sterling Crown Private Bank, this is Walter Higgins. I told him my name. I told him my husband's name. I told him I'd found a statement in a closet and I needed somebody to explain it to me. There was a pause. Not a surprised pause, a careful pause, the kind a man gives himself when he's choosing his words like they're landmines. Then Walter Higgins said 4 words that I will never ever forget as long as I live. He left you nothing. The floor actually tilted under me. I don't remember what I said back. I know the call went on for a few more minutes, but I couldn't tell you a single other word that was spoken. What I do remember is hanging up and standing frozen in my kitchen in Nashville, Tennessee, holding a phone that had just quietly demolished everything I thought I understood about my own marriage. If you've ever had a moment like that, where one sentence just rewrites your whole life in real time, hit that like button right now because this story is about to get a lot wilder. Stick around because what I found in a storage unit 3 weeks later is the part nobody ever sees coming. Walter Higgins did confirm the account was real and that Frank was the account holder, but told me I'd need to come to the Dallas branch in person with ID, Frank's death certificate, and proof of marriage for anything further. That phrase, "he left you nothing," sat in my chest like a hot coal all night. I didn't sleep. I lay in the same bed Frank and I had shared for almost 2 decades and stared at the ceiling, doing the math on every sacrifice we'd ever made. I thought about the year my dad needed emergency gallbladder surgery and didn't have great insurance, and I called Frank crying from a hospital parking lot because we didn't know how we were going to cover our part of the bill. He held my hand that night and said, "We'll figure it out, Dee. We always do." We scraped together $3,800 from savings, and it felt like the biggest sacrifice of our lives. And this whole time, $50 million. I got up at 4 in the morning, made coffee, and sat down with a legal pad. Not a plan yet. Just a list. Every memory that suddenly looked different in this new, ugly light. The Sunday phone calls with Debbie. The way she always seemed to know Frank's moods and decisions before I did. The Christmas 2 years before he died when she handed us a gift check for $1,000, and Frank had taken it with this strange, flat expression, like a man enduring a transaction, not receiving a gift. The way Tony always changed the subject the second money came up, with the practiced smoothness of a man who'd been coached. By 6 a.m., I had 2 full pages of notes and a feeling in my chest somewhere between grief and rage. The grief was old, living in me since the day Frank died. The rage was brand new, clean, and pointed somewhere. I was scared, honestly. I was a 42-year-old part-time receptionist with no lawyer on retainer and no wealthy friends with connections downtown. Just a legal pad, a bank statement I found by accident, and 4 words ringing in my ears. So I made 3 decisions that morning, and I still think they were the smartest 3 decisions of my entire life. Decision 1, I wasn't telling a soul. Not my younger sister Diane in Memphis. Not my sweet, well-meaning, can't-keep-a-secret-to-save-her-life neighbor Betty Sue. And absolutely not Debbie, who called me every other Wednesday to check in, which suddenly sounded a whole lot less like sisterly love and a whole lot more like someone keeping tabs. Decision 2, I was getting a lawyer, not just any family attorney, but somebody who specialized in contested estates and hidden assets, somebody who would not be impressed or intimidated by a private bank's polished front desk. Decision 3, and this one I sat with the longest. I was going to Dallas. I was going to walk into Sterling Crown myself and get answers face to face. But I wasn't going unprepared, and I sure wasn't going alone. I searched Estate Attorney Nashville Hidden Assets Deceased Spouse on a laptop at the public library. I didn't want that in my home browser history. I found 3 names specializing in probate litigation and asset discovery, put on the charcoal blazer I saved for parent-teacher conferences, and drove straight there. Her name was Renee Ashford, early 50s, sharp reading glasses, an 8th-floor office downtown that said serious without needing to shout it. She listened to my whole story without interrupting once, and I'd later learn that when Renee Ashford went quiet and just looked at you, something important was coming. "Mrs. Callahan," she finally said, taking her glasses off, "you were smart not to tell anyone. And you were smart to come to me before you ever set foot in that bank." She walked me through Tennessee's spousal rights law. As Frank's surviving wife, I was legally entitled to what's called a spousal share of his estate, basically a guaranteed cut that no paperwork can erase, even if his trust tried to shut me out completely. The real question, she said, was how this account had been legally structured. A trust, a business entity, a beneficiary designation, because private banks love helping wealthy clients build walls that are perfectly legal but perfectly designed to keep a spouse out. "When a bank manager says he left you nothing," Renee told me, setting her glasses back down, "that tells me there was some kind of formal instruction on file. A letter, a named beneficiary, a trust document. We need to find out exactly what." She filed a formal spousal inquiry that same afternoon along with Frank's death certificate and our marriage license, addressed straight to Sterling Crown's legal department. She also filed a petition with the Dallas County Probate Court demanding a full disclosure of assets. These weren't aggressive moves, she explained, they were procedural. But they were also, by design, a signal flare. Anybody connected to that account was about to know I was aware it existed. That's the moment it really hit me. Whatever door I was opening, there was no closing it again. If you're new here, this is exactly the kind of true story drama I love covering. Real families, real secrets, real courtroom showdowns. Subscribe now because the twist coming up in a few minutes is one you will not see coming. I drove home to 2 missed calls on my landline, both from Debbie. I let a third one roll to voicemail. Hey, it's me. Just thinking about you, call me back when you can. Tony says hi. Tony had never once said hi in 16 months of Wednesday calls. I wrote that down too. The following week I drove to Dallas, told nobody where I was actually going, and left Betty Sue a note that said I was visiting an old college friend. I brought 2 full folders of documents just in case one got lost. Sterling Crown Private Bank sat on the ground floor of a glass tower downtown. Quiet, expensive, deliberately unbothered. A receptionist walked me to a conference room. Walter Higgins came in 4 minutes later, silver-haired, somewhere in his 60s, with the practiced calm of a man who'd spent decades sitting across the table from hard conversations. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "now that your attorney has been in contact, I want to be straightforward with you. We've been expecting this meeting." He slid a folder across the table. The account, he explained, had been opened about 5 years into our marriage, under something called the Callahan Family Legacy Trust. Frank was the person who established it, and the trust named 2 beneficiaries to inherit everything after his death, Debbie Callahan Reyes at 60% and Tony Reyes at 40%. My name was nowhere on that document. Not one single line. But then Walter Higgins slid a second piece of paper across the table, and I watched this composed, unshakable man's expression actually flicker for half a second. It was a handwritten addendum, dated 2 weeks, almost to the day after my dad's emergency surgery. 2 weeks after I'd cried in that hospital parking lot while my husband was quietly sitting on $50 million in Texas. In Frank's own handwriting, it read, "If my wife Dee ever discovers this trust, she is to be told everything, and the trust is to cover the cost of her own independent attorney. I trust she'll know exactly what to do." I stared at that paper for what felt like 10 minutes straight. Somewhere in those quiet years, my husband had carved a door into the very wall he'd spent so long building around me. I didn't know yet if that made things better or so much worse. I didn't know if it was guilt or love or some tangled combination of both. What I did know was this: I now had hard proof in my hands, and Debbie Callahan-Reyes had absolutely no idea I'd just read it. Now, this is where the story takes a turn nobody, not even my own attorney, saw coming. About 3 weeks later, Renee called with something strange. Her investigator, a former financial crimes guy named Sam Farrell, had traced the trust's original seed money to a storage unit outside Memphis, rented for over 15 years under a name I didn't recognize, R. Callahan Holdings. It turned out my father-in-law, who'd passed away years before Frank and I ever met, had built a small but successful chain of regional trucking depots, a business he deliberately split between Frank and Debbie after a bitter falling out with Debbie's first husband over money. Frank had spent over 2 decades quietly managing and growing his half in secret, terrified that if Debbie or Tony ever learned how much it was really worth, it would tear the family apart all over again the way it had when he was a teenager. Inside that unit were boxes of old letters between Frank and his dad, tax records, and a faded photo of Frank as a boy standing outside the very first depot. None of it made what Frank did to me okay. But it did explain, in a strange, heartbreaking way, why a genuinely kind man built a fortune in total secrecy, and why he'd agonized over it enough to leave me that handwritten note. Renee called it a gold mine of proof. Showed the money had roots going back generations, and more importantly, that income earned during our marriage had absolutely been funneled through our joint accounts along the way. Which brings us to the part where things got personal and honestly a little ugly. Debbie stopped calling my cell after the probate filing went in. Then she called the landline. Then Tony called from a number I didn't recognize, and because I didn't recognize it, I picked up. Dee. His voice was that same big, confident salesman energy. "We need to talk. Tony, talk to my attorney." "Your attorney?" He said it like the words physically offended him. "Dee, we're family. Frank would be devastated watching you drag his memory through a courtroom over a private financial matter." "Talk to my attorney," I said again, and I hung up. My hands, I noticed, were not shaking. I filed that away as new information about myself. They showed up on my porch the following Tuesday, dressed like they'd rehearsed it. Debbie in the cream coat from the funeral, Tony in a sport coat too expensive for a random Tuesday. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. "We're not here to fight," Debbie said, soft and grieving. "We loved Frank. This trust was his private choice. Going to court will cost everybody years, money, heartache. What you're doing," Tony added, "is going to expose things Frank wanted kept private. Where some of that money came from. That could reflect on you, too." I looked him dead in the eye. "Are you telling me my husband's money was obtained illegally?" Tony blinked, clearly not in the script. "I'm saying his business dealings were complicated. Private. Court makes all of it public." "Then I guess it becomes public," I said. "Renee Ashford has your number." And I closed the door. I stood in that hallway a long time after I heard them walk off the porch. Tony's voice carried through the door, sharp and low, not meant for me but reaching me anyway. "She's not backing off. We need to call Prescott." Prescott. A name I'd never once heard. I wrote it down the second I got to my kitchen table. Renee wasn't surprised. "That threat about illegal money is a bluff, Dee. If that money had a dirty origin, the last thing they want is a court process digging through it. They're trying to scare you into walking away with nothing." She told me she'd chase down the name Prescott the moment full financial disclosure came through. I let myself have exactly 1 day to fall apart after that. I drove out to a state park east of Nashville, left my phone in the car, and walked the trails for 2 hours in the crisp fall air, the leaves doing that fierce reddish-orange thing Frank always used to call the angry color. I cried for him, not for the money, for the man I loved and the stranger I'd apparently also been married to, and how both of those men could exist inside the same person without canceling each other out. Then I drove home, made soup, and slept 9 hours straight. 10 days later, a certified letter showed up from a firm called Prescott and Doyle LLP out of Scottsdale, Arizona, the same firm, it turned out, that had drafted the original Callahan Family Legacy Trust years earlier and had been quietly managing it ever since. The letter was polite in that unsettling, lawyerly way. It acknowledged my spousal claim, and it referenced Frank's handwritten note. And in full and final settlement of all claims, it offered me $1.1 million. $1.1 million out of a $50 million trust. I did the math twice. That was barely over 2%. I laughed out loud, alone at my kitchen table. Not a bitter laugh, more like relief, because I finally understood exactly what kind of fight this was. That offer wasn't meant to be accepted. It was meant to test how much fight I had left. Called Renee. Rejected. Tell them we'll see them in court. If you've made it this far, drop a comment telling me what you would have done with a $1.1 million offer, but stick around because the courtroom scene coming up is the part everyone in the comments always talks about. The following weeks went quiet. No more calls from Debbie, no more porch visits from Tony, just the slow machinery of the court system grinding forward. I leaned on people, which honestly isn't like me. I drove to Memphis and told my sister Diane everything in her cluttered, garlic-smelling kitchen. She listened without interrupting, then said, "That man, Dee." That man, 3 times, each carrying a different weight, and somehow those 5 words covered everything I hadn't been able to say out loud yet. Diane came back to Nashville with me the next weekend, and we went through old photo albums together, finding little pieces that suddenly made sense. A Dallas hotel receipt for a trip I never knew about, a business card with no name, a birthday card from Debbie that read, "You're doing the right thing, Frank. Trust me." Diane photographed every page and sent them straight to Renee. I also went back to work, which felt small but honestly saved me. Appointments to check in, kids in the waiting room asking for stickers. None of them cared about trust funds or Sterling Crown. That grounding mattered more than I expected. The discovery hearing landed in February at the Dallas County Probate Court. Not a full trial yet, just the moment, as Renee put it, when the other side has to stop being vague. I wore the same navy suit I'd worn to Frank's memorial, no jewelry except my wedding ring, which I hadn't taken off. Not for sentiment exactly, or not only for sentiment, but because in a hearing about what I was owed as his wife, it felt exactly right to have it on. Debbie and Tony sat across the room with 2 attorneys from Prescott and Doyle, including a sharp, confident lawyer named Marcus Doyle. Neither of them looked at me when I walked in. Renee had spent weeks combing through years of trust records, and what she found was airtight. The trust's original funding had come in part from a $40,000 withdrawal out of our joint checking account in the trust's earliest days, a withdrawal I never authorized and had zero memory of. I had receipts proving I was in Memphis that entire week visiting my dad. When that document went into evidence, the whole room shifted. Not dramatically, courtrooms don't work in movie moments, but I watched Marcus Doyle pause mid-sentence for the first time all morning. I watched Tony lean toward Debbie and whisper something fast and low. I watched Debbie press her lips together in a way I had genuinely never seen her do before. The judge, the Honorable Loretta James, a small, no-nonsense woman who clearly did not have time for delay tactics, asked Doyle directly whether he could confirm the source of that initial trust funding. He dodged the question. She pressed again. "Mr. Doyle, the transfer is dated and it originated from a joint account belonging to Frank and Dee Callahan. We have the bank record. I'd like your client's response." Silence. Then Doyle finally said, "The trust's position is that Mr. Callahan had authority over joint marital funds as primary household earner." "Was this withdrawal ever discussed with Mrs. Callahan?" the judge asked, turning to our table. Renee stood. Your Honor, Mrs. Callahan has a sworn statement confirming she was out of state that entire week and had no knowledge of this transfer or the trust it funded until these proceedings began. I sat there and let the facts speak for themselves. I didn't look at Debbie. I didn't look at Tony. I just kept my eyes on Judge James. Over the next 2 hours, Doyle's confident arguments fell apart piece by piece. The trust's funding, the money that had been quietly rerouted out of our marriage, and finally that handwritten addendum, which Renee called Frank Callahan's own written admission that his wife deserved the truth. At one point, Debbie was asked point-blank whether she'd known at the time that the trust involved marital assets. Her lawyer objected and the judge sustained it, but the question had already landed and everyone heard it. When we stood to leave that day, Debbie looked at me for just a second. Her face was still composed because Debbie was always composed. But her eyes had gone empty in a way I recognized, the look of somebody who has been holding something up for a very long time and just felt it start to slip through her fingers. 12 days later, Judge James issued her ruling. Renee called me at work, right in the middle of me checking in a 9-year-old for his cavity filling. "Dee," she said, "we won." The 23-page ruling found that the trust's initial funding, having come from marital money without my knowledge or consent, was an improper use of our shared assets, and that the years of continued transfers only made it worse. My legal share of the estate was calculated, with the growth it had earned over the years, at just under $25 million. If you think Debbie and Tony deserved every bit of what was coming, type silent revenge in the comments right now. I want to see how many of you are riding with me on this one. 'Cause it was about to get so much sweeter. Doyle filed an objection within 48 hours, which Renee had already told me to expect. It was denied 3 weeks later. What followed was months of back and forth. Prescott and Doyle offered $16 million. Renee said no. 19. No again. $22 million, on the condition that Debbie and Tony keep the rest without further dispute. 22 is a real number, Dee, Renee said. The rest could take another year and there's always risk. What does the ruling say I'm entitled to? Just under 25. Then I want just under 25. I swear I could hear her smiling through the phone. All right. We decline. The final settlement came through that June, $24.6 million plus $75,000 in legal fee reimbursement, transferred to an account in my name. Debbie and Tony kept the remaining balance, minus just over $1 million in their own legal fees by the time it was all over. The morning that transfer cleared, I was sitting in my backyard in Nashville with a cup of coffee and Betty Sue's orange tabby cat perched on my porch railing like he owned the place. I looked at that number on my banking app for a long time. Then I called Diane. "It's done," I said. She cried. I didn't, not right then. That good, long overdue cry came later, alone in the quiet of my own house. Before we officially closed things out, Renee took her glasses off one last time and told me something I still think about. In over 20 years doing this work, Dee, I've had very few clients hold up the way you did. That $1.1 million lowball would have broken most people. That porch visit would have broken most people. You never flinched. I flinched, I told her. I just did it in private. She smiled. Same thing. One more thing mattered to me more than the money. A few weeks after everything settled, I drove back to Dallas and asked to see Walter Higgins one more time. I laid a copy of Frank's note on the table. I trust she'll know exactly what to do. He came in alone to write this, I said. Did he seem guilty? Scared. Walter thought about it. He seemed like a man who wanted to leave something right. I drove home. I sat under the oak tree Frank had planted in our very first year in that house, and I let him be complicated. I let myself be the woman who survived it. Money doesn't fix your life overnight. Changes things slowly, in layers you only notice looking back. The first thing I did was buy a brand new washer and dryer, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to pick whichever one I wanted without flipping the price tag over first. I set up a real financial plan, started a small foundation covering surgery costs for families who can't afford them, named after my dad, whose gallbladder surgery started this whole chain of events. I traveled with Diane to Portugal. I went to Scotland completely alone that November, something I'd always been too scared to do, and it turned out I was really good at it. I still work part-time. I started a little support group for adults starting over after a divorce, an illness, a loss. 9 people showed up the first time, 3 of them stayed an extra hour just to keep talking. Still fills up every season. As for Debbie and Tony, their legal bills cracked something open in that flashy Scottsdale life. The house with the pool eventually sold. I don't feel satisfaction about that. I feel distance, clean, earned distance from a chapter that finally properly closed. I still think about Frank all the time. The man with the secret and the man who left me a door, both living inside the same person. Marriage, it turns out, is a living record, and mine held more deception in it than I ever imagined, but also more love than I gave it credit for at the time. The oak tree Frank planted our very first year is taller than the roof now. I put a bench underneath it. Some mornings I just sit there with my coffee and I think about that woman who found an envelope in the back of a closet, and I think, you know what, she did just fine. If this story hit you right in the chest the way it still hits me every time I tell it, do me a favor, smash that like button, subscribe to Silent Revenge if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me what part got you the most. And hey, if you know somebody going through their own version of starting over, send this one their way. Quiet people take their power back too. I'll see you in the next story.